So today we are going to finish up the section on development. On Thursday together we spent a lot of time talking about cognitive development and reviewing Piaget's model. We dipped our toe into the section on language, and I'll circle back to that at the beginning today. After we talk about language development, nature and nurture is a big theme within that discussion. We'll then turn our attention to social development in the form of attachment. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about changes during adolescence and adulthood. And the real pick-me-up finish for today's session is on death and dying. So that's kind of the lay of the land for today. On Thursday, when we meet face-to-face, we will work on emotion, stress, and health. One day, one chapter. The upshot of this is that you will then have 2 chapters worth of learning curve quizzes to do Sunday night. One section on development, the other section on emotion, stress, and health. Next Tuesday, we will do one day, one chapter online on personality. The personality quizzes will then be due Wednesday night, because then next Thursday we will be doing test number 3. So that's kind of lay of the land as we go forward from here. Let me pop down to where we left off. On Thursday, at the end, we talked about phonemes as the most basic unit of sound in a language. And we talked about morphemes as the most basic unit of meaning in a language. And I gave you some examples of parsing words to identify how many morphemes are in them. So I gave you the word players, and we said that there were 3 because the S means plural, the ER means a person who does something, and the play part means what they do. And then I briefly put up this hierarchical structure of language slide showing you how sentences break down into phrases, phrases into words or morphemes, and then individual phonemes, those sounds that comprise those specific words. Where I want to go now, briefly, is to a discussion of elements that help us comprehend language. That is, what are the things outside of the words themselves that help us comprehend what people are saying to us, or help other people understand things that we might be saying to them. So first off is this concept of syntax. It says here the surface structure. Syntax refers to the rules that determine the ways that words are combined within a given language. So basically, syntax, if we try to boil this down, has to do with common shared rules of grammar. Okay? So if I give you a syntactically correct sentence, it might be something like, the boy kicked the ball. Okay? The syntax in English is typically, we begin the sentence with a subject, then we give a verb or an action word, and then we might have an object. Maybe I expand on that sentence and I say, the boy kicked the ball down the street. I have a prepositional phrase now, giving me some additional information. Okay? If I say to you, the boy kicked the ball down the street, you probably don't have a very difficult time understanding or comprehending what I'm saying to you. But if instead I said, down street boy kicked the, what? What did that mean? Are you drunk? Right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the words are all jumbled. You've got jumbled syntax there that makes it difficult for the listener to understand what you're saying to them, right? And if we're trying to be clear in our use of language, we have to follow the rules of syntax or the rules of grammar. Number 2 here, at a deeper structure level, we have to think about semantics. Semantics refers to the rules for connecting the symbols in our language to the things that those symbols represent. So semantics is basically an issue of vocabulary. And when you see the deep structure part of this, it should make you think of deep processing, right? When we talked about that final demonstration in the section on memory, it was about deep processing. It was about what we called semantic encoding, thinking about the words because you wrote them in a sentence. Well, semantics has to do with the connections we have between the words that we use, or even the letters that we write when we're writing, and what those things refer to in the real world, right? So the word cat, C-A-T, does the word cat actually look like a 4-legged furry animal at all? Obviously the answer is no, correct? So how do we know? We know because we've explicitly spelled out the connection between that series of letters and that object, that animal in our environment. So that's a deeper structure where we're looking at meaning, right? We're connecting these symbols with the things that they refer to in the world. So we're, again, thinking about meaning, okay? That helps people understand what we're talking about, right? If I said the cat barked, would you understand what I'm talking about? You probably would scratch your head and think either you meant the cat meowed or the dog barked. But the cat barking doesn't make any sense at the level of meaning, right? The message that you're sending to me isn't really comprehensible when you mix up the words in that way. What else helps us comprehend language? Well, number 3 on the list here says extra-linguistic cues or context. This would boil down to nonverbals, okay? What are some nonverbals that help people understand what you're saying? Can you give me some examples in the chat box? Gestures. I love that one, Megan, because that's what I lose here when we're doing an online session, right? I'm gesturing, sitting here at my dining room table like a knucklehead gesturing around like I would if we were face-to-face, okay? Because that helps to explain things. Facial expressions, eye contact, voice volume, right? Voice tone, even things like posture, right? All of these are sort of the packaging, if you will, that we wrap around what we're saying to help people get the message that we're intending to send, right? Because if you think about it for a second, you could have exactly the same words mean 2 very different things, depending on how those words are packaged with these nonverbals, with these extra-linguistic cues, right? So I could say to you, get out of here. And you hear me giggle a little bit, and I'm smiling, and I'm playfully waving at you. Versus if I said, get out of here, with an angry look on my face. I'm pointing at you, a louder voice volume and an angry voice tone. Now you know something different's going on, right? It's a different message that I'm intending to send in those 2 different contexts. So the nonverbals play an important role. And then finally, conversational cooperation. And this refers to the common shared rules that we have regarding taking turns. Okay? When we talk about taking turns, when we take turns in a conversation, how do we let the other person know that we're done talking and it's their turn to talk? What do we typically do? We use pauses, right? I'm assuming, Matthew, that you don't walk around when you're done talking and you don't say to your friend, like, over, right? Your turn now, right? No, you'll stop and you'll say, so how was your weekend? And you're kind of looking at them and you're making eye contact and you're doing some of these other nonverbals that we just finished mentioning above, right? So all of these things together, if you think about them, are the elements that help people comprehend language. You like how I'm doing the pink for October here on the box? It's nice, huh? So comprehending language is facilitated by following the rules of grammar, by using the vocabulary that other people expect you to use, by wrapping it in nonverbals, and by taking turns and indicating that it's someone else's turn by using pauses. All of those things help facilitate communication when we're talking about the use of language in social situations. Any questions about any of that? That's not the hardest thing that we're going to do today, so I'm not going to beat that into the ground. What I want to do now is turn our attention to the nature versus nurture issue again. I said this is a big theme in the second half of our course. So we want to discuss now the degree to which language acquisition, that is learning to speak, we think about development here, right? Little ones, infants and then toddlers and first graders and fifth graders and ninth graders. How are they learning language? Is there a genetic predisposition for the development of language? Is there some kind of nature, biological underpinning here? Are babies like born with something that makes them able to learn language? Or is this language development driven by language exposure, that is nurture, that is moms and dads talking to you and reading to you and singing to you? Is it one or the other? As you're probably going to guess, if I were to ask you, it's a combination of both, right? But let me summarize some of the evidence on the front end here that we have compiled over time that indicates that babies are born ready to work with language. I'm going to give you 2 pieces of evidence that suggest that we are equipped from birth to pick up language and run with it. The first piece of evidence that suggests a genetic predisposition to the development of language is the fact that infants vocalize the entire range of phonemes that are found in all the languages of the world. Think about that for a second. Infants vocalize, that is, they make noises that are consistent with all of the noises that are part of all the languages in the world. Now, at some point, they get rid of some of those sounds, right? What happens is, at about 6 months of age, they begin to make the sounds of their native tongue, and they start to discard the sounds of other languages. So this is kind of like what goes on with, older versions of Windows computers where you used to have this desktop cleanup wizard. Do you remember that? And if you had icons on your desktop that you weren't using, it would prompt you to get rid of those. Like, you're not really using this, you want to get rid of that. Well, in a similar way, infants, based on what they're receiving from their language environment, start to dump sounds that are not part of what's happening within that environment. So that's the first piece of evidence that would say babies are built ready to do language. The second piece of evidence that's consistent with a nature-driven genetic predisposition to the development of language is the fact that children begin to master language early on in life without any formal instruction. Okay, so children master language early in life without formal instruction. What do I mean here? I mean that little ones learn that the way that you make plurals in English is you put S on the end of a noun. Now, one sits down with an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old or a 2-and-a-half-year-old and says, let me explain to you the difference between nouns and verbs. Let me explain to you what we mean by singular and plural. Let me explain to you that plural means more than one, and when we do plural in English for these nouns, we add an S on it. Oh, let me also explain to you that there are some exceptions to those rules. So the plural of child is not childs, it's children. Awesome. Let me explain to you that verbs in English, what are verbs? Let me explain to you that again, right? We don't do that instruction. We talk to them, and they learn things just by what is on the system there and ready to master, right? So there are things sort of pre-built and loaded on such that youngsters are very good at developing these language skills even without any formal instruction about plurals, about regular and irregular verbs, about past tense or past perfect tense or future tense or any of that stuff. They just start doing these things. So this would say language is something that is to some degree innate, right? These language capacities unfold because we're kind of built to do language. The other way that we know that we're built to do language has to do with what we know about the underlying biology in our brains related to language. And this is all review from what we talked about in the bio section, right? Language acquisition, it says here, depends on motor and sensory system development. So there are two separate and relatively independent systems that have to do with movement and sensation. The movement system, the motor system, is contingent on the functioning of our motor cortex. Somebody remind me in which lobe of the cortex we have the primary motor strip. Is that frontal, parietal, occipital, or temporal? Yeah, that's frontal lobe, right? The back of the frontal lobe. Good, you guys are way more awake than the 8 o'clock section was when I asked them about that, right? And the motor cortex there has connections with Broca's area, and this is what allows us to do language production, right? Or what's sometimes referred to as expressive language. Let me show you this graphically on this next slide, right? So here's speaking words, Broca's area, and the motor cortex. So the motor cortex, again, the backside of the frontal lobe, and as I said on that previous slide, this is specialized for language production, or what is sometimes referred to as expressive language, where you're saying things and you're producing speech. We have a complementary system, an independent but complementary system that is about sensation, that is about sensory inputs, and it involves our auditory cortex and the connections of that auditory cortex with Wernicke's area. Who remembers the lobe where we've got the auditory cortex? Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, it's temporal. So temporal lobes, in and up from where your ears are. And instead of language production, the sensory system has to do with language comprehension. So comprehension is what I'm trying to type here. And rather than expressive language, you'll often hear this referred to as receptive language, right? Receiving messages from other people, being able to comprehend me right now. As you're listening to me, you are using your receptive language abilities. Your auditory cortex would be lighting up if I slid you into a PET scan machine or an fMRI machine, right? Here it is, right? We could see at the top of the temporal lobe here, Wernicke's area and the surrounding auditory cortex as well in those temporal lobe areas. So again, this is for language comprehension, and we often refer to this as receptive language, to be contrasted with the expressive language that has to do with producing speech. Okay? If I were to damage, let's say for a second here, Wernicke's area, and I couldn't comprehend language, yet my Broca's area was still intact, I could show evidence of something that's referred to as fluent aphasia. Fluent aphasia is a situation where my expressive language capacities, my ability to produce language, are intact, but I can't comprehend what people are saying to me. So I'm fluent because I can still speak, but as we talked about in the bio section, right, this is a situation where what you would produce would be rambling and nonsensical, would be unconnected from what the question might have been. Okay. In contrast, if your receptive language areas were intact and you damaged Broca's area, get some problems with the motor strip, let's say here, you would end up with a situation where you'd show evidence of what we call non-fluent. Just to fit it on here, let me do it that way. Non-fluent aphasia, right? Non-fluent means what? Well, you damage this area, you can't produce speech, you can't express yourself, but you could still potentially be comprehending things if this Wernicke's area over here was intact. So you're stuck where you understand what people are saying to you, but you can't respond to them because of these problems with speech production. Okay, so whether you like it in words on this slide or with the pictures on this slide, that tells us more of a story about the underlying biology here related to language acquisition, right? It's about both expressive language capacities, that is the ability to produce speech, as well as receptive language abilities, that is the ability to comprehend what people are saying to us. Let me stop there for a second. Questions on the brain regions underlying language acquisition? All right, I'll assume that you've got it. Let me bounce back for a second to this slide. So we've told a fair amount of the story in terms of nature and biology, right? These two pieces of evidence that we have a genetic predisposition for the development of language. We looked at the biological underpinnings that are relevant to language acquisition. Rather than just jumping right into nurture, what I'm going to give you is a model to bridge the two. Okay, kind of like what we did with intelligence, and we talked about the reaction range as a model to bridge nature and nurture as contributors to intelligence or IQ. Here we could talk about a model that lets you think about not only the nature stuff that was going on up above, but down below here, the nurture elements as well. And the bridge comes in the form of this model that's known as the critical period hypothesis. So let me explain that with this slide. The critical period hypothesis, as it says here, is this idea that there are biologically determined time periods when you've got to be exposed to something, and in this case the something is language, in order for normal development to unfold. Okay? So the key terms here are critical periods, put a nice pink box around that, or sensitive periods, or an even simpler and more colloquial expression, a window of opportunity. Okay? The idea here is biology determines when this window is open and also when the window starts to close. There's the nature part of the story. But environment gets to play a role as well here, because look what it says here. Environmental input is important for the development of language. So let's be explicit. When we say environmental input, this is what? This is the nurture part of the story. But it also says here that biology determines when that input is needed. So here's the biology part. We know that when we see biology, we should be thinking about nature. So it says here, environmental input is important for the development of language, but biology determines when such input is needed in order to make sense of it. So the way I think about this is that this critical period hypothesis says basically the environment or nurture determines what the input is, but biology determines when that input is going to be maximally helpful for the development of whatever the skill might be. And in this case, the skill is language acquisition. Okay? So here's the idea, guys. There's a clock that's ticking from the time you're born that represents this critical period, this window of opportunity. That's biologically determined. And we're going to talk about some times for acquisition of the first language and even for acquisition of the second language where you are maximally able to develop those skills. Biology determines when. But the environment is what determines what that input is. Okay? And by what we might mean. Am I being exposed to English or German or French or Japanese or Swahili or what? Right? Nurture determines what we get. Nature determines when we really need that to make optimal use of it for the development of language skills. Okay, so what I like about this critical period hypothesis is that similar to the idea of a reaction range, it lets us blend together. I hope you see this, right? It lets us blend together considerations of both nature and nurture, in this case for the development of language skills, right? You don't have to choose one or the other. You get to say biology runs the clock and environment, nurture, gives us the input that is necessary for language acquisition to occur. Okay? So it's not either or, it's both and. It's both nature and nurture within this model. All right? Let me stop there for a second. There's a lot of words on that slide. I want to make sure that's clear to you guys. So Jamil has a question. The chat box is open for that. Let's see what that is, and then I'm going to give you some more specifics about the when here. Like, how long do we have this window of opportunity available to us in order to be able to learn a first language or maybe a second language? How does this unfold over time? You don't get to really get this connection between when you say them, I don't know what you mean. The environmental input and the biological input. So the biological piece here is running the clock. It's the timekeeper. And the clock is ticking from the time you're born. And biology determines when you need that. And basically, to give away the answer, biology says the earlier, the better. Okay? The earlier, the better. In fact, I'll even put that explicitly on the slide. The critical period hypothesis basically boils down to the earlier, the better for the development of normal language skills. Okay? The nurture, the environmental piece, determines what that input is. While the clock is running, What is the environmental input going to be? Is it going to be German? Is it going to be English? Is it going to be Spanish? How much input are you going to have? Is it going to be input from people who really know those languages really well or not? Are they going to read to you? Are they going to sing songs to you? All of these things are about the quality of that nurture piece, the environmental input. So there's input from your environment, what the language is, how much of it you're exposed to, which acts upon this window, this time clock that's running, that is biologically driven, right, that nature is driving. And again, the take-home message is going to be, the earlier you get the input related to language, the better. Does that make more sense? Yasmin, you can type your question in as well. Good. That's why they pay me the big bucks here to clear things up. You're welcome. I'm going to give you some specifics in a second about first language acquisition and even second language acquisition. Like, how wide is this window? Can I wait, to talk to my newborn until he's like 2? Should I start talking to him earlier? Well, you can guess, given that I've said the earlier the better, it's going to be, I'd rather talk to him right away rather than waiting until he's like 2. It's probably not going to work as well if we, for some reason, delay that environmental input. So if an infant is exposed to more than one language, they will know both languages. Absolutely. I'll use that as my segue into this. So let's talk about first language with bullet point number 1 here. And let's talk about second language with bullet point number 2. The first bullet point says, late exposure to a first language results in poorer language skills. Why would you have late exposure to your first language? Let's just say that's English. Why would you not be so good in English if you had late exposure? Well, because you're running the clock within this critical period. We're not saying you're not going to learn English at all. You're just not going to learn it as well. And you might scratch your head and say, well, why the hell would you have late exposure? Okay. Sometimes, in extreme cases, it's some form of abuse. More often, late exposure to a first language might be because of some kind of medical condition. So you've got a really compromised immune system, and you can't be around people and be exposed to the kinds of germs that are all around us every day, okay, because you would get sick and you would die. So we have you isolated from human contact for 12 or 18 or 24 months, okay? And you don't get people talking to you, reading to you, or singing to you anywhere near as much as somebody who doesn't have that medical condition. What we're saying is we would expect when we tested you later regarding your language skills, right, spelling, vocabulary, grammar skills, etc., you're going to do worse than somebody who doesn't have that delay in exposure to the first language, okay? Look at the second language. Yasmin was asking about second language. Yeah, they can learn both. But if you learn a second language after the age of 6 or 7, okay, you tend to have poorer language skills in that second language. Now, this is sort of ironic, right? When do we generally first require kids to learn a second language in school? So that window is not completely closed because some of you guys will learn it if you learn it in middle school or in high school, right? But it's harder. It's harder than it would have been if they had only just started with you earlier on, okay? How do we know this? Well, we can look at immigrants. This is a great study that was done years ago with immigrants from Asia, okay? They looked at performance on a grammar test, right? Something like subject-verb agreement, regular and irregular verbs, making plurals, knowing the difference between its and its, and the difference between there, and there. What we see is that the immigrants who arrived in the U.S. by age 7 are basically indistinguishable from folks who were born in the U.S. But once you arrive later than age 7, there is a linear deterioration in your performance. The longer and longer and longer it has been to your arrival, your performance on that grammar test is compromised, right? So the worst performance are the people who arrived later and later in comparison to folks who arrived earlier, right? The older your age in immigration, the poorer your mastery was of that second language. Again, the dependent variable here is grammar test score, okay? But if you come within that window of opportunity, within the critical period where the clock is running, right, and you get here and you learn English by age 6 or 7, you're going to be basically indistinguishable from folks who were born in this country. Okay, so you can see that in terms of language skills in the second language really obviously with the data and the graph from that specific study. Okay, let me stop there for a second. Questions about this evidence for the importance of exposure to language. This is the nurture part of the story, right? This is the nurture part of the story because this is telling us that we need environmental input, right? We need the nurture part for things to unfold. And the previous slide here was really blending the two together. It's saying nature determines the running of the clock and nurture determines what that environmental input is. All right, I got a couple of questions. You guys can fire those into the chat box. We've got about 45 minutes to go. We're in good shape. We're almost done with language and we're going to start talking about social development. Yeah, learning and becoming fluent in it. I don't know where the bar is going to be set, but the point of this slide is that when you learn it after 6 or 7, you're going to have poor language skills in that second language. So if you want to define it as being fluent, yeah, oh my goodness, Megan's question. Is the learning of a second language after 6 or 7 just an assumption of when we learn the second language like at school or else what it is there? Yeah, I'm thinking more of like formal instruction in a second language in a school setting where, let's say it's in the U.S. and the primary language is going to be English, and now we're going to start teaching you Spanish or French or German or whatever. Okay, in an academic setting, not that you are going to move with your family to Spain at age 9 or 10. Okay, that would be an immersion kind of thing. Would be something quite different. Does that make sense? And that's really, what we're getting at here is, again, the later and later you arrive in that environment where you're going to be learning that second language, the worse and worse those skills are going to be. That's what I really want you guys to understand. All right, let me push a couple of magic buttons here and give you guys a chance to answer a polling question. So I'm going to convert the check mark up above the list of names into an A, B, C, D choice. You're going to roll over that little A to choose your answer to this question here. I'll be back in a minute to check it out with you guys. All right, let's do 10 more seconds. Oh my goodness. Okay, so clearly that was a little too easy, right? So, but look at the question. This is an interesting scenario, right? Children who spend their early years isolated from human contact and the sound of adult language are unable to develop adult language skills despite extensive training efforts later on. Okay, we've had the window of opportunity close, right? We're well past the end of the critical period, and even if we do a whole bunch of remedial kind of work, we're not going to get back to where we would have been if we had been exposed to this language during that critical period. Good. We won't need to beat that in the ground. You guys got it. All right, let's continue on in our review of development here and start turning our attention for a little while to social development. We're going to spend about 15 minutes or so talking about attachment, and then 5 minutes or so talking about some different parenting styles related to social development as well. So when we talk about social development, again, we can do a whole section on this. We can do a whole course, really, on social development. I've chosen to focus us in on attachment. And if we want to define that here, it's the strong emotional connection that persists over time and across circumstances. So what we're really talking about here is the bond, right? The bond that we see between mom and baby or dad and baby, right? This connection, this bond between those two people. It's strong, it's emotional, it lasts over time. It's not just when they're little, it's all the way through their life. It's not just in certain circumstances when you're home, but not when you're out and about. And one of the major researchers in attachment is John Bowlby. And Bowlby, you read about him in the textbook as well, argued that infants have what he called an innate repertoire of behaviors. One of my favorite phrases here in the section on social development, this idea of an innate repertoire of behaviors that drive or motivate adult attention. What does he mean here? He means that there are things that babies do that pull people in, that make adults rally around them and pay attention to them. And in this sense, Bowlby argues that attachment is adaptive, right? It's adaptive for a human infant to be able to suck people in and pay attention to them. Why? Why is it important? Why is it adaptive for you to have some behaviors that draw adults in when you're an infant? Tell me in the chat box. Why would this be considered to be adaptive? Survival, right? You're not self-sufficient as a baby. Gabriel, yeah, we got folks who are not self-sufficient into their 20s and 30s now, right? So the idea here is there are things that babies do, the most obvious of which is something like crying, right? The baby cries to indicate that something is not right, okay? They could be hungry, they could be thirsty, they could be tired, they could be sick, and it's like, hey, come and pay attention to me. Okay. Besides crying, tell me in the chat box, what else do babies do that would be considered to be part of this repertoire of behaviors that draw adults in? Or what other characteristics do they have? They look cute, they might throw things. So explain to me more about cuteness. What makes them cute? They might giggle, that makes people come around. They got big eyes. We've got people suggesting they might poop to draw attention in. They're tiny little people. They have big heads and tiny bodies, right? Their heads are 1/3 of their body length. If you or I had a head that big, I'm 6 feet tall, my head would be 2 feet from top to bottom, right? They've got chubby little cheeks. All of these things, right, draw people in to provide protection and security and addressing of the needs that they have. If they didn't have this repertoire of behaviors, we wouldn't see them lasting very long because, as someone said earlier, they're not particularly self-sufficient. So attachment clearly is important. The big challenge early on in attachment research was trying to find reliable and valid ways of measuring it, right? Kind of like we knew intelligence was important, but how the hell are we going to measure this thing? Well, one of the best stabs at measuring attachment was done by someone named Mary Ainsworth. So let me get her name on the slide here to give credit where credit's due. And Ainsworth developed an approach known as the strange situation test. Here's the deal. With the strange situation test, if I boil this down as simple as I can, I have a youngster come in to a research laboratory setting, set up like a living room, play area. There's a chair, some toys and books and balls and other things. And what we've got initially is mom and baby in the room together, okay? In the second part of the study, what happens is mom leaves, and in the third part of the study, what happens is mom returns. If you were trying to gauge attachment, trying to measure this emotional connection or this bond between mom and baby, which of these three panels are you most interested in looking at and trying to maybe describe different styles of attachment? Where would you get really interesting information? Well, when mom leaves, that certainly tells me something about how this little guy feels about her, and clearly he's upset, he's not happy about her departing. Where else might you look to get more information about this connection, this attachment? What do they do when mom returns? And that's exactly what I want us to focus in on. How does a child respond when she leaves? And how does the child respond when she returns? Those are two good pieces of information, right? Look at this little guy. He's like squeezing her shirt, right? If you've ever picked up a little one and they're excited to see you, they sort of squeeze their fingers in and wrinkle your shirt like that, okay? That's a good thing. That says something about the quality of this connection. Well, you can slice and dice the strange situation test results in different ways and sometimes come up with 3 attachment styles. I've seen 4 attachment styles. To keep it simple, I'm boiling it down to 3 styles of attachment, and I'm going to map them onto the consideration of what happens when mom leaves and what happens when mom returns. When we do that, we get a little table that looks like this. So here's the name of the category: secure, avoidant, and ambivalent. And by the way, the percentages are the percentage of U.S. sample kids who fall into that category. So 7 out of 10 are in the securely attached category, 2 out of 10 are in the avoidant category in U.S. samples, and then 1 out of 10 in the ambivalent category. I built the columns here by looking at the reaction of the child when mom leaves that laboratory setting with the toys and the books and the balls and other things. And I look at what happens when mom returns. So if we do this, it gives us a nice way to compare and contrast these different attachment styles from Ainsworth's research. So what did she find? Most kids in the U.S. fall in securely attached category. Securely attached kids, when mom is in the room with them, will use her as a secure base from which to explore the room. They'll bring things over to her. They might say, look at this, mommy, or they might roll the ball to her and want her to roll it back, etc. When mom leaves, the securely attached kids show some distress. So I'm going to drop a line across here and say, if we anchored this with low levels of distress on the left and high levels of distress on the right, I would probably say these kids fall in the middle. Okay, they're falling somewhere in here, some distress. They're upset that she's leaving, but they're not melting down. They're not inconsolable. And when she returns, oh my goodness, they're so excited to see her, right? You might see them run over to her. You might see them leap into their arms. The door opens and like, mommy, 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 right? That kind of excitement, that enthusiasm that you see with the securely attached kids, okay? That's category number 1. Second category are the kids who fall in this avoidant category. They're kids who are distant and aloof even initially. When they're in the room with mom, they're not connecting with her. They're not bringing the toys over and saying, look at this, check this out, isn't this cool, etc. So when mom leaves, these are the kids who show on the range here of low to high levels of being upset. They show almost no level of upset at her departure. They seem to not really care. Whatever. She's gone, who cares, right? In the third panel, when mom returns, the avoidant kids are either slow to greet her, that is, it takes them some time to reconnect, or they might actively avoid her. And that might manifest itself in something like she comes back into the room and they're sort of playing on the floor with a toy facing the door, and they see her come in, and they might sort of scooch over and spin around and turn their back to her, right? Literally giving her the cold shoulder, right? That's the second style, this avoidant attachment. The ambivalent category at the bottom here are the kids that when they're in there initially, they're not really exploring the room all that much. But here's what happens. When mom leaves, these are the kids who are having that meltdown that I said the securely attached kids were not having. So we've got low upset on the left, high levels of upset on the right. They're almost off the scale here, right? Upset and panicky when she leaves. Now, just for sake of thinking about this, for a second, with your hand, cover the lower right green box, okay? Don't read it. Don't look at it. Cover that last box in the green column where it says, when mom returns for these ambivalent kids. Now, if I told you that in the red box here, these kids were upset and panicky when she leaves, what would you suspect they might respond with when she returns? Tell me in the chat box. Happy, joy, right? Happy, happy, joy, joy. Some kind of relief. It would calm them down, right? No. This is the ambivalence, right? Ambivalence means you seem to have these two conflicting emotions. Well, what they do when she returns is they're angry at her. They can be actively resistant to her. So they don't just kind of scooch around and ignore her. These are kids who might show angry, resistant behaviors. They might hit her. They might push her away. They might say things like, no, mommy, no, right? They don't want to reconnect with her in any way. So that's the ambivalence, right? I'm upset. I'm disturbed by her departure, but I'm not relieved by her return, okay? There's some kind of mix of feelings here that don't seem to make sense altogether. Again, about 10% of U.S. samples fall into that final category. Okay. What I would likely do on the test when I give you a question about attachment styles is describe something. Let's say you're watching a video of Ainsworth, research using the strange situation test, and here's what you see. What category does this child seem to be fitting into? And I would describe it in very clear terms that would map onto what happens when mom leaves and what happens when mom returns. Does that make sense? Questions or concerns about the depiction there of the different attachment styles? All this, again, mapping onto her strange situation test. That's basically her way of getting at this attachment thing, right? Like Binet developed the IQ test to measure intelligence, she developed a strange situation test to try to quantify in some way this attachment thing. It's not easy to do, but she's trying to do it. Okay? A couple of questions, you guys could type them right into the chat box. And then we'll talk about some of the factors that might influence this attachment process. Yeah, these are not really stages so much as they're different categories that describe kids at this point in time. So I wouldn't really think about attachment as being characterized by stages. We measure maybe when they're 12 months of age or 18 months or 24 or 3 years old. And generally those attachment styles are relatively consistent over time. So it's not like they're shifting across different stages as they get older. Does that make sense? Yeah, you're not going to have every kid fit neatly into one of these categories. So there might be some kids, whenever you draw boxes like this and try to say these are the 3 ways, you're going to have some kid who doesn't neatly fit into any of them. For our purposes, let's just assume that we can neatly fit kids into the boxes that we've drawn out here. Yeah, when mom returns in secure attachment, they're just thrilled that she's come back. Right? So there's a little bit of distress. It's almost like this little guy here, right? He's upset, but then maybe he settles himself and starts playing with the ball again. When she returns, they might get up and run over to her. They might jump into her arms. They might say, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, where did you go? I'm so glad you're back. Do you want to play?" Whatever. Something that indicates relief at her return and excitement about her reconnecting. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think back to my oldest when he was a little guy. I would pull the car into the garage and he'd be running out the door that connects into the garage as I'm pulling the car in. I'd be like, "Dude, stand there so I don't run you over." Right? That was the excitement. Right? Or if mom came home, he'd hear her car, he'd go running out the front door to see her. That would be that enthusiasm upon the parent's return. All right. You might ask, what are some factors that might affect this attachment process? I'm going to suggest on the front end here that there is a reciprocal relationship going on between moms and dads and their babies. That is, there's a two-headed arrow that would best describe the nature of this attachment relationship. It's not just what the baby does, and it's not just what the mom or dad does. It's a dance here, right? So reciprocity always means a two-headed arrow. So there are things that the child brings to this relationship that can have an impact on it. One child characteristic that's relevant is their temperament. When we talk about temperament, we usually make this monolithic distinction between easy temperament babies and difficult temperament babies. What's the difference here? Well, as the name suggests, easy temperament babies are, well, easy. That means they don't cry a whole lot. They get into regular cycles with respect to eating and sleeping. When they're crying, there's something wrong, and when you address that problem, they stop crying. They sleep relatively regularly. When you try to get them dressed, the easy temperament babies, it's not like a wrestling match. Difficult temperament babies, getting them dressed is a wrestling match. You're tired after you have to get them dressed. Difficult temperament babies cry, and they cry a lot, and it doesn't always seem to be clear why they're crying. Okay, they don't sleep regularly. They don't eat on regular schedules, etc. Is that going to affect this bond or this connection? Absolutely. I'm not saying that you don't love your child who has a difficult temperament, but it's different, right? What they're bringing to this dance of attachment is different from someone who has a child who is an easy temperament child, okay? What do the parents bring to the table? Okay, parent characteristics could include the parent's age, right? The parenting skills of a 16-year-old are quite different potentially from those of a 26 or 36-year-old. What do the parents bring to the table in terms of their mental health status? We know very well from research done with depressed moms, so I'll type in here maternal depression, that depressed moms interact differently with their babies than do non-depressed moms. They don't hold them as much. They don't talk to them as much. They don't sing to them as much. They don't make as much eye contact as the non-depressed moms. I'm not blaming them. I'm just describing some of the things that might go on here in this attachment process, right? So what are you bringing to the table as a parent, okay? What is the environment within which this attachment process is unfolding? That environment can include everything from the physical environment. Are they in a studio apartment or a 4-bedroom house? How many other kids are present? What are the ages of those other kids? What's the parents' level socioeconomic status? Where does this family live, right? SES refers to the parents' level of education and income. What kind of neighborhood are they in? All of that would be the context, sort of the background on which this attachment process is playing out. Okay, and then hormonally, there's a hormone that is released during delivery, during labor and during delivery, after delivery, called oxytocin. So this is relevant, obviously, only for moms. Oxytocin is considered to be, somebody in the first class called it the cuddle hormone, right? It's this hormone that's ramped up that helps to build this physical bond, this connection between moms and babies. So after delivery, if everything is in good shape and mom is okay and baby is cleaned up and checks out okay, they bring that baby over to mom and place the baby on the mom's chest, and this oxytocin thing is pumping, coursing through mom's system, helping to build that connection between moms and babies. Make sense? So these are all things to consider when you're wondering, like, well, why does one child end up in the secure category and another child ends up in avoidant or maybe ambivalent? These are a number of factors that might play a role in that process. Okay? Any questions on those factors at all? Cool. Well, here's what happens. They're little for not very long. They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you've suddenly got to do parenting. Let's talk about parenting styles that have been outlined and described for us by Diana Baumann. And Baumann looks at parenting on 2 dimensions. How much warmth is being expressed by the parents in terms of affection, those sorts of things. So we can characterize parents as being on one or the other end of this warm-cold continuum. And then the second continuum that we can look at is the degree to which parents are exerting control. Well, if you cross 2 by 2, you get 4 different styles of parenting here, the 4 quadrants within this little table. So we're going to talk about authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved parenting. Authoritative parenting, upper left here. By the way, before I start talking about these, your mom and your dad might be in different squares here in this little matrix. Okay, dad might be authoritarian and mom might be authoritative. Okay. Mom and dad themselves can have different parenting styles depending on what the child is like. Remember reciprocity, right? What does the child bring to the table? You might need to be a little more authoritarian with one child and a little more authoritative with another, for example. So what goes on here? Well, in terms of the parenting styles, let's start with the upper left quadrant, the authoritative parents. These are parents who, if we look at the intersection here, are warm and exerting control. These are parents who have clear rules with consistent enforcement of those rules. So the children can explain what the parents' expectations are for their behavior, maybe for what they're doing in school, for what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do, the rules around bedtime, etc. Okay? Clear rules with consistent enforcement, and there are rewards for compliance. So rewards for compliance means when you follow the rules and you do what you're supposed to be doing, mom and dad reward you for doing so. Okay? So if you're expected to clean your room on Saturday and you do it, they might present you with ice cream as a reward for doing that. Okay, there's good communication here with this authoritative style of parenting, right? There's interplay, interaction between parents and children, especially as the kids get older, right? So there's room for maybe some negotiation with a 16-year-old that you won't have with a 6-year-old, okay? So parents do that good parent-child communication as well. Not surprisingly, given how we're describing this, authoritative parenting is a parenting style that is associated with the best outcomes in children. When you look at academic and social and other kinds of outcomes, kids who have authoritative parents generally have the best outcomes there. Why? Because they're getting what they need, right? They're getting the warmth and the affection, but they're also getting control. You might not think it when you're a child or adolescent that you need your parents to exert control, but trust me, when you're down the bottom here and you're not exerting control as a parent, it's a recipe for disaster. Okay. What's going on up top here with authoritarian parents? The good news is they're exerting control. The bad news is they're kind of cold in the way they do it. What do we mean by that? Well, these are parents who are exerting control, but they're doing it in a cold, unresponsive, or rejecting way. Okay? So rather than doing this sort of ruling with the consent of the governed that you see with the authoritative parents, what we get with the authoritarian style is much more of what feels like a dictatorship. So this is a dictatorial style. This is a much more sort of militaristic style. So let me give you an example. Authoritative parents with a 16-year-old who's planning to go out with his friends to the movies, let's say. The 16-year-old might say, well, I'll be home around 11:30. And the parents are like, well, we thought you would be home by like 10. Well, after the movie, we're going to go get some ice cream. And okay, so you negotiate something, and the authoritative parents say, let's split the difference, say 10:45. Okay? What the authoritarian parents say? What do you think their response is when he says, I'm going to be home at 11:30? Megan says the answer is no. And what do they say? 10 o'clock on the dot. Yasmin's got it, right? So it's this much more rigid. Maybe rigidity is the way to describe this authoritarian style. There's no give and take, right? There is a dictatorial sort of rigidity to this that characterizes the authoritarian style. Again, the good news is they're at least exerting control, because when we get down the bottom here, it's not going to be a pretty picture. It's not good for kids to have parents who are not exerting control. But the authoritarian style is a different kind of feel, okay? As we do these different quadrants, you might also think not only of your own parents, but aunts and uncles or friends' parents. Like, oh yeah, my friend's dad was a total authoritarian guy. And that helps you remember, right? That style, that's fine. As long as he's not going to see your notes get mad at you, you can do it that way. Down the bottom here, not exerting control, permissive parents, sometimes called indulgent. That's actually a pretty good descriptor of this style. Right? Indulgent parents are the ones who want to have their kids happy all the time, and they want to be their best friends. That's actually not really the parent's job to be the best friend, but instead is to, be in control here. So indulgent or permissive parents are warm and caring, but there's no guidance and there's no discipline. When you ask about like what's this child's bedtime? Oh, whenever they really want to go to bed, it's fine. Stuff like that. Okay, very hands-off, and sort of the children are running the show. Trust me, that's not the way you want to go. Lower right side, in uninvolved, the word you often see with this style is neglectful. Okay, you'll see this sometimes referred to as neglectful. If I could ever type it correctly, I'd get it on there. Uninvolved parents are providing no warmth, no rules, no guidance, and I always think about the phrase, I have kids, ? I did not know that, right? So they don't ever go to any of your sporting events. They have never seen your teachers. They may not even know what school you go to, okay? They are just completely detached from the role of playing the role of a parent, okay? Just disconnected in that way, uninvolved. Okay, again, best outcomes up above here where we get authoritative parenting, good communication, clear, consistent rules. You get rewarded for following the rules, etc. If you want to land somewhere as a parent, this is where you want to try to land. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. Questions on that at all? Yeah, Yasmin, go ahead. While you're typing your question in, and Madeline as well, I'm going to give you guys another polling question. So you guys can answer this while we're seeing their questions pop in. We've got about 15 minutes to go here. Yeah, you know, parents could be a mix. They may not fit neatly into one of those boxes. As I said, you might be a little bit different with one child than another child. It depends, right? What are they bringing to the table? So it's not like you get married or you decide to have kids and you say, here's the box we're going to be in, or here's the box I'm choosing. It's fluid. There's a fluidity to this that certainly characterizes how this all unfolds. Does that make sense? So any scenarios I describe on a test question will neatly fit them into one of these boxes, but the real world is certainly going to be messier than that. All right? Good. I'm going to give you guys another 10 seconds on the question here. I want to make sure we can get through everything in our last couple of minutes here. How do we do here? All right, that's 49 out of 57. We'll take that, right? They're based on correlations, and correlation doesn't mean causation. What's the key word in the question that lets you realize that this is correlational research that's been done about parenting styles? Megan's got it, right? It's about an association between A and B. A is authoritative parenting, B is positive outcomes. Good, I'm glad you guys are picking up on that specific element there. It's about an association. All right, let's run our way through adolescence and adulthood real quick. Adolescence, we know they've got abstract thinking in place. We talked about this, right? On Thursday, we talked about the formal operational stage. They can think about what might be, right? They can imagine what-if scenarios. They can do more sophisticated things in math and science. We get that. Where they're still having some hang-ups is with respect to their social thinking. Their thinking about social situations is characterized by a degree of egocentrism that is how we typically think about egocentrism, right? I'm the center of the universe. I want to talk about me and only me and nothing else, right? I'm thinking only about myself in most situations. So I might have a personal fable, is the way sometimes this research describes social thinking in adolescence. A personal fable is when the adolescent overestimates the uniqueness of their feelings, right? They say things like, no one has it as bad as I do, right? No one has ever felt this sad. No one's parents have ever been as mean as you guys are. Poor, poor, pitiful me, right? The personal fable of adolescent social thinking. Or the imaginary audience. What do you guys think this is about? In social situations, what are adolescents prone to believe is going on in those social situations? If there's an imaginary audience, what are they thinking? Their life is a movie, and what is everyone doing with respect to that movie and their life, right? Everyone is going to notice, right? Everyone's going to notice. Or I'm always on stage, right? I'm really concerned about the perceptions of me by other people, right? Everybody is paying lots of attention to what I'm doing, what I'm wearing, what I'm saying, so I need to be really worried about all those things. There's an egocentrism, obviously, to that way of thinking, okay? Let's talk about adulthood. I'm going to warn you before I start running through the slides here, there's lots of downward arrows. Let's look at what changes go on once we get past adolescence. Physical changes. Most adults reach their peak of physical functioning at 25 to 30 years of age. If you're past that, you may not even realize that that was the peak. Vision gets worse. You notice mom and dad squinting more, holding the book as many feet away from their eyes as they can to see it. Muscle strength and flexibility decreases. What do your parents and grandparents do when they sit down or stand up? Have you ever noticed? What do they do that you youngsters don't do? That grunt sound, right? They're like, oh, right? Or they stand up and they make that noise. That clearly relates to muscle strength and flexibility. Basal metabolic rate slows down. You're not burning up calories as quickly as you used to. So what might happen? And be nice in how you say it. Weight gain. That was pleasant in the way that you described that, right? So those are changes in terms of physical functioning. I've got a nice little comic here from the New Yorker describing what happens. Happy 40th, says the Grim Reaper. I'll take the muscle tone in your upper arms, the girlish timbre of your voice, your amazing tolerance for caffeine, and your ability to digest French fries. The rest of you can stay. Apparently that's what happens there past age 40. Cognitive changes in adulthood. What happens with information processing? Well, your perceptual speed decreases. You know what that means in English? Things like reaction times get worse. You guys notice that with your parents or grandparents? Do you like riding in the car with your grandparents? How's that for you? Can be a little scary, right? Their reaction times maybe not what they used to be. Memory for factual information can decrease, so you can see things like, problems recalling things from episodic memory, right? Memories. What was the name of that guy who used to live next to us? Oh, I can't remember his name. That kind of thing. Recall. So when we do short-term memory tasks, they might remember more like 5 or 6 on that 5 to 9 range rather than 7 or 8 or 9. Okay. One upward arrow. Right? Thank God we've got something here. Verbal ability looks like it actually improves. If it doesn't improve, at least it will sort of hang tough and not be a downward arrow. Why might verbal ability hang on or actually improve as you move into, let's say, your 40s and your 50s, moving through middle adulthood? They're talking a lot. How are you increasing your knowledge? What do you now have time to do? You're maybe teaching your children, working with your children, vocabulary skills. You have time to read like you didn't have before, right? There comes a point in which you don't have to go to 5 different practices in a 2-day period or 3 different games. Like, oh, this is called an hour of free time. I can actually read this book or a magazine or a newspaper. That's probably what's responsible for that thing holding up better than almost anything else. Bingo. Are you saying the game might help with verbal ability, or is that what they enjoy doing? Things like that, right? Crossword puzzles and so forth. So I'm trying not to scare you completely, but that's the picture as we look at things that go on during adulthood. Scrabble as well. Final slide in the section on development. There's a real pick-me-up is on death and dying. So this is summarizing a model from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who, before she died herself, laid out a model of the stages of death and dying. And the model is trying to describe the processes involved with maybe finding out, let's say, that you have a terminal illness. Let's say you find out that you have some form of cancer and your doctor says to you, you have 12 to 18 months to live, most likely. Okay? Kubler-Ross says we go through these 5 stages. The way I remember the stages of death and dying is that they spell the word DABDA. And it's not really, honestly, a word, but you can remember DABDA as your little mnemonic here for these stages. Stage 1 is denial. 2 is anger. 3 is bargaining. Stage 4 is depression. And then finally, acceptance is stage 5. Not everyone goes through these stages in exactly this same order. Certainly, not everyone spends the same amount of time within each stage. But in stage 1, with denial, what we have is the person denying that anything is wrong, right? Or that they are in fact dying. So there's, the response is basically no. There must be a mistake. This is not possible. I have lung cancer, but I never smoked. How is that possible? You should re-examine the results. There's no way that can be true. Okay. Stage 2, anger. This is sort of the why me stage, right? Why is it that I'm the one that gets lung cancer and my uncle, who has been smoking for 45 years, is not dead yet, right? Anger and frustration at the unfairness of what is happening to you. Stage 3, bargaining. This is the stage where you want to kind of make a deal, right? You make a deal with God, right? If you let me live, ... right? If you let me live, I'll be a changed person, right? If you let me live, I will stop knocking down little old ladies and stealing their marble rye. If you let me live, I will stop kicking every puppy that I see. If you let me live, I'll stop smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Okay, that's bargaining. Stage 4 is depression, when the reality starts to set in, and you may see a sense of powerlessness, sometimes even a sense of hopelessness. Okay, where the person is sort of feeling the emotional weight of the situation and feeling sad about their impending demise. And then acceptance is when they are resigned to their fate and they accept it. Okay, acceptance, the final stage here within Kubler-Ross's model. Again, not everybody goes through them in exactly this order. You might skip a stage. You might spend way more time in one stage than another stage. But it's a useful rubric, right? It's a useful heuristic here, a model for thinking about how this might unfold. Again, when you get something like a terminal illness diagnosis and they tell you you've got, 12 to 24 months to live. Okay? Any questions on any of those 5 stages of death and dying? Let's go to Yasmin for her question. And then I've got one more thing to share with you before we wrap up for today. Yeah, stages of grief, you hear talked about with respect to that as well. Her original model is really about you yourself getting something like the diagnosis that I described before. What I've got for you is a little video link that I want you to click on and check out within your browser. It's a link to a video showing a giraffe, and it is from Robot Chicken, showing this giraffe going through the 5 stages of death and dying in about a 2-minute period. So I'm going to turn my mic off, and I'm going to play it myself again because it's so entertaining. So there you go. That would be the way that you turn death and dying into something somewhat entertaining, right? Heaven has a Slurpee machine for everybody. If that would be heaven to you, then you're in good shape. Do you guys like that? Anybody ever seen it before? All right. Final questions on anything from this whole section on development. So cognitive development all the way through death and dying. Fluent aphasia would be a situation where, let me pull up the slide. It was this next one where you have damage to Wernicke's area, let's say, and you could still produce speech because Broca's area is intact, so you could still do production or expressive language, but you can't comprehend what's being said. So you're fluent because you can still produce speech, but because you're not comprehending what people are saying to you, the speech you produce can be pretty odd, right? It could be rambling and nonsensical and not related to maybe what you were asked. Does that make sense? That's a good question. What is it that's lost and gained for physical in adulthood? And I don't even remember what the hell I had. So worse vision, worse muscle strength and flexibility, decreased basal metabolic rate. The only gains we had were in the cognitive domain where we talked about verbal ability improving. Yeah, so damage to Wernicke's is what's responsible for that, right? Because, Julia, that's what would take away the ability to comprehend what people are saying to you, right? So that's receptive language in Wernicke's. If you had a stroke, let's say, and you damaged Wernicke's area, that's what you would end up with. All right, again, assuming that Broca's area was intact, because that's what helps you to produce the speech. Good. Anything else? Cool. I got 10:46. My battery is down to 23%. I think that means we're done. I do have online office hours starting at 11. I'll set up a Collaborate session for that. Make sure you X out of here so that I can make the recording available to your classmates as soon as possible, all right? See you guys Thursday morning at 9:30. Have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thanks, everybody.